Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagements at the Joint Special Operations University. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Special Operations Command, and the Joint Special Operations University. If you have questions after the session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Jeff Rogg, a professor of strategic intelligence at Joint Special Operations University, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Mike Vickers to discuss his new book, By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. Dr. Mike Vickers began his career as an Army Special Forces non-commissioned officer. He then commissioned as a Special Forces officer and later served as a CIA operations officer, during which he spearheaded the CIA's covert action program to support the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union. He then obtained an MBA from Wharton and a PhD from Johns Hopkins, during which he also worked in the Office of Net Assessment. He returned to government as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, and later the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Dr. Vickers, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Pleasure to be with you, Jeff.
So to set the stage now for those who are viewing the interview, you spent most of your life serving in the shadows, and now with your memoirs, you're shedding light on some of your experiences. So what made you decide to share them now?
Well, three reasons, really. One, I felt I had a duty to history. I was fortunate enough to play a part in three major historical events: the Afghan covert action program you mentioned that drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan, our campaigns to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda, particularly from 2007 to 2015, and then the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Second reason was those of us who serve at the top levels of government have an obligation to share what we can with the American people. Secret operations are overseen by select congressional committees, the way our republic works, but necessarily the American people don't have privy to that. So where we can share something, we should. And then finally, I had a duty to my fellow professionals, those in the future who will serve as special operators, intelligence professionals, and national security strategists, to try to pass on whatever lessons I could. It isn't easy writing a memoir if you've kept secrets all your life, and there's a lot more that aren't in the book that I will take to my grave. And of course, I have moral and legal obligations to clear everything that I've written with the government, and CIA, DOD, and others really helped in that matter.
And you wore so many different hats during your career in government service: Special Forces NCO officer, CIA, and then policymaker too. Was there a formative experience that you had that really helped establish your worldview and guided your approach to national security throughout your career?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I think certainly my time in the Special Forces was very formative, and then reinforced to a lot of degrees or refined in certain ways in my service in CIA as an operations officer. You see different aspects of the world in those jobs. And of course, time evolved. And then in net assessment in later years, in my graduate work, and then thinking about the rise of China, again, maybe more evolution than, formative view, but certainly evolved over time.
And that's something that really stood out in your book is it reads so easily, and yet there's so much information in there that you're sharing, both based on your career and also your own education. And what really stood out to me, especially in terms of professional military education, is you always seem to have a voracious appetite for information. You consume so much of it, both in preparation for your career in Special Forces and then the agency. How did you combine education and practice? And for a venue like JSOU, what advice would you offer our students in this respect?
Yeah, great question. So, special operations and certainly Special Forces in my day provided a lot of training opportunities. So I had extensive training the first 5-6 years I was in the military that helped shape a lot of my future career. And I came into Special Forces with just under 2 years of college with this Russian and some international relations. And so continued to study languages, learn Czech and Spanish, and take courses wherever I could, eventually, completing my bachelor's degree in international relations, but also reading outside of that. And then, that continued later with Wharton and CIA and Office of Net Assessment. And, as I broadened. And I think the advice that I would give is one of the things that helped me was, one, as you said, reading broadly at the beginning, but also really if you combine education and training, really trying to develop mastery in a craft, special operations, and then CIA, clandestine and covert operations, and then broaden over time. And so my later years, graduate study and then net assessment and work I did at a think tank I co-founded helped broaden me for other duties. And you mentioned the assistant secretary for special ops and low intensity conflict. It had a third thing on there when I served for 4 years called interdependent capabilities, which was all the department's operational capabilities under one senior official. So nuclear weapons, space, missile defense, cyber, transformation of the military services, defense planning guidance. I wouldn't have been prepared for those duties had I not broadened in mid-career.
And that's, you've seen history yourself, and you read a lot of history in your preparation. I got a chance to start reading your dissertation, which you mentioned is 1,000 pages. Elliot Cohen must have loved reading that.
He calls it a doorstop or a brick of a dissertation.
But it's so interesting.
3 bricks, but it's 3 volumes. So
it was 3 volumes.
Yeah.
You look at military innovation over time, and you've identified several periods of military revolution. Could you perhaps tell us the period that you yourself have lived through? Because now you studied it looking backward, and now you live through your own formative period of military revolution. So what do you observe?
Yeah, so I think beginning in the late 1970s or mid 1970s, the U.S. really started pulling ahead in the Cold War by advances in information technology that translated into precision weapons and sensors that could see deep, things like the J-STARS, surveillance aircraft, synthetic aperture radar, things we talk about today with Ukraine, the Army Tactical Missile System, and then stealth. So precision weapons and stealth. And then that F-117 and then follow-on aircraft. And that created deep strike capabilities that really worried the Soviet General Staff and started obsoleting their strategy in their view. And one of the reasons, the conservative General Staff backed Mikhail Gorbachev is they thought they couldn't compete over the long haul. And the U.S. really had a monopoly on this for a couple decades. And that's why, Desert Storm went very well, and our wars in the Balkans went well, and, applied it, supporting resistance forces in Afghanistan in 2001, et cetera. But the Chinese really, first among all other nations, really went to school on what the U.S. did in Desert Storm. And they developed a concept called anti-access aerial denial, which was really aimed at using asymmetric means of that revolution, surface-to-surface missiles and other things, to try to make it difficult for a U.S. to get into a theater. They thought the big lesson of Desert Storm was you're nuts if you let the U.S. take 6 months and build up forces on your doorstep. And so as the Chinese have developed their own response to this ongoing precision weapons and stealth revolution, and they've been behind in stealth in other areas, and as I said, they've adapted asymmetrically, they've eroded U.S. power projection in the Western Pacific over a number of the past couple decades. And military revolutions, in my view, from my PhD work, have 2 kind of processes. One is transformation, some form of land warfare becomes another rather abruptly. but there's also the emergence of new forms of warfare, undersea warfare, air warfare, nuclear warfare, etc. And now we see space and cyber as warfare domains. So that's being added on to this revolution, as well as, having at least two major competitors in it. There also may be, in very early stages, another revolution unfolding in terms of real automation and artificial intelligence and things like that, where we really move way more into the unmanned systems domain. But that's still in its early stages.
So that's such an interesting transition, in technology. And one thing that emerges from the military revolution and the military revolution debate is it's not necessarily about the technology or who innovates it. It's about who best incorporates it into perhaps their strategic culture, their way of warfare, how they use it against adversaries. And you yourself lived through not only this military revolution that was part of your career, but also the strategic transitions, and your career tracked them. So could you explain, how the world has changed strategically for the United States from when you started your career to, say, the middle period to when you ended up as a very senior policymaker?
Yeah, sure. Let me first say, it's certainly not exclusively about technology, military revolutions, but sometimes it largely is, like atomic weapons, for example. We already had long-range bomber aircraft, first the B-17 and then the B-29, and the ideas, the operational concepts. And so what was needed was the explosives that could really go boom. Other times, technology plays a real small role, like the French Revolution, Napoleonic Revolution. There was technology there, but it was really, mobilizing society, and then the operational concepts and organizations that made Napoleon so effective. And so, the weights vary. And then the other important point is that first mover advantage allows a competitor to really steal a march on the others. It makes offensive power projection generally much better, but it doesn't ensure strategic victory. You can still overreach, just as competitors do, try to take on too much of the world or some other form of overreach. And as long as competitors can adapt to that new world, survive and then counter it in some way, either by emulation or some asymmetric counter, you can still lose the wars at the end of the day. You may win the initial wars or initial battles and still lose. And that's replete with, the Japanese with carrier aviation, or the Germans with air armored warfare, Napoleon I mentioned earlier. So, that's kind of one of the big lessons. Military revolutions are dangerous periods in which you'd like to be first, but you also got to be last, or at least survive. So then on your point about strategic transitions, the Cold War had different phases. And, I was there for the last 15 plus years of it, or 18 or something like that, when the U.S. started really pulling ahead. And then you had that period of U.S. unipolarity. Wasn't all that exciting, and quickly passed. We didn't do all that much with it. And then obviously the 9/11 period, governed by the war with the global jihadists, principally Al-Qaeda and its allies, but also offshoots like ISIS. And now this new era, some call great power competition or strategic competition, but really characterized by the rise of China, and then secondarily by, kind of a revanchist Russia. So 4 national security eras and over the course of my career. And, not only have strategic circumstances, the competitive geopolitical landscape evolved, but technology has as well.
You mentioned something interesting, the phenomenon, you can win the war and lose the peace, or lose the war and win the peace. And, certainly Afghanistan is known as, it's one of the most remarkable covert action operations done during the Cold War, perhaps the most, and it helped lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. One of the issues, and this is part of the difficulty with the idea of intelligence failure or blowback from covert action, but certainly that what we've seen in Charlie Wilson's War, for instance, is that warning about what you do here and now isn't enough. You have to secure the effects of what you've done, win the peace as well. So what I'm curious about is covert action. It seems like a lot of times during the Cold War, the plan was the covert action itself. But then there wasn't really as much of a what happens down the pathway of if the program succeeds or if the program fails. So could you talk a little bit more about what you saw happen as the covert action program in the 1980s progressed, and then what happened after with the 90s?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think that's unique to covert action necessarily. I think it's true of a lot of military operations as well, that there is this challenge of winning the peace. And even when you do, history marches on. God bless Frank Fukuyama and the end of history, but, it doesn't end. And so I have a chapter, not a chapter, but a section at the end of the book called Success is Never Final, which, maybe you buy yourself 50 years historically, but inevitably things change, or a new actor tries to take you on, and the next generation has to be prepared for that. So the challenge with Afghanistan after the end of the Cold War was a combination of things that made it difficult for policymakers. One was the tremendous success in winning the Cold War, and so U.S. attention shifted. As the last Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan in February 1989, that was the great year when Eastern Europe started to become liberated, Berlin Wall fell, and the U.S. started really focusing on those issues and the reunification of Germany. And so with the idea that while we continued to support the Afghan resistance, and they actually the communist Afghan government actually outlasted the Soviet Union by 4 months, kind of one of the ironies of history. But, U.S. attention shifted elsewhere once the Soviets left. And then the second thing that happened is that there was a law passed by Congress called the Pressler Amendment that a guy named Larry Pressler from, I think, South Dakota, if I remember right. But whenever a U.S. president couldn't certify any longer that Pakistan wasn't past a threshold in developing nuclear weapons, that it would have to cut off aid. And that all aid. And so Pakistan was one of our biggest aid recipients during the late Cold War. And in 1990, that occurred. President George H.W. Bush couldn't certify that anymore. So that made disengagement from the region even more likely. And we had this long, 12-year hiatus of disengagement with Pakistan, which caused us challenges after 9/11. Then Afghanistan broke into a civil war between 92, when the Afghan resistance won, and 95, 96. And finally, the Taliban come to power and bring in Al-Qaeda, provide a safe haven to Al-Qaeda. And that leads you to 9/11. It's not a straight path, though, in a sense that there were choices, maybe difficult ones, that U.S. policymakers had. But even if you look at the period after 96, when we have the first World Trade Center bombing in 93, and then, bin Laden's fatwas, and then the embassy bombings, and then the Cole. We did a cruise missile strike against camps in 98 after the embassy bombings. But if we had known what we knew after 9/11 and how we adapted our strategy, we would have behaved differently, I think. Now, I wasn't, in a senior administration position at that point, but I certainly would have been advocating for things like we did after to deny sanctuary, rather than treating terrorism as a kind of a minor problem that you react to, rather than a war you have to fight, as we did in the 90s. So there's lots of lessons there.
The one thing that I always observe in intelligence history, and the historians are the best at predicting the past. It's so easy as opposed to predicting the future, which is one of the perceptions of what, say, the CIA and the US intelligence community is for. But there's a difference between actually failing and being perceived to have failed. And that happens all the time in the agency's history. The Soviet detonation of Jo-1, the first nuclear weapon, invasion of South Korea by North Korea, the fall of the Soviet Union. Oftentimes, it seems like the agency has provided strategic warning, but not that it's going to happen at this time, in this place, in this way warning. So if intelligence failure is really as much a matter of perception as reality, how can intelligence professionals help policymakers and the public understand those limitations of intelligence?
Yeah, and two others, of course, 9/11 is a great example of strategic warning, but not tactical warning. We knew they were coming after us, provided extensive warning about that, just didn't know when, where, or how, and the precise details. And then Arab Spring is another, where you can analyze the governments and think they're in real trouble, but you don't know that some guy's going to light himself on fire in Tunisia, and then it'll spread to these countries. And one of the things the U.S. is good about is then once you have a failure of a kind, is then kind of catching up tactically. So even if it missed at first, then it will start zeroing in on it and provide much better timely warning to policymakers. Intelligence failures come in a lot of varieties, not surprisingly, kind of reflecting intelligence disciplines, and so you can have some that are analytical failures or failure of judgments, and they usually occur because it's just a complex problem. Is the Soviet Union going to collapse? There's no secret you can steal that'll tell you that. And there's so much going on there that you have pretty high odds of getting that wrong. The exact details when and how it will happen, or if it will happen. Arab Spring's another example like that. And then other judgmental failures can be perhaps like Hamas and Israel. You fought them a lot of times, you see them mobilizing or exercising, but you read it more as an exercise because of the current state of affairs. And I don't know that to be the case, but it's not that you have an absence of collection. You may actually see this through drone imagery or others. You just mistake it for one thing rather than another. Sometimes there are collection failures that go with it. So Iraq WMD is a good example, where it was bad intelligence, that was later rescinded about, fabrication that Saddam had a currently operational biological weapons program that he didn't. So one, I think, is you have intelligence failures regularly. It's still better than anything else. When we've audited the PDB, it's right about 70% of the time. U.S. policymakers are more informed than any policymaker on the planet, but it's not perfection, and the thing I would add is policymakers still have a burden to deal with the intelligence they have. And senior operators, operational commanders, have that same burden. And so you have to adapt your strategies or policies to that reality, not waiting for immaculate, perfect intelligence, because you may never get it, but making decisions based on what you have. You still have the obligation to defend the United States. And, the bin Laden raid is an example of that. We had really good intelligence, but it was circumstantial. And so there wasn't definitive proof that he was there. President Obama had to make a decision, go or no go. And some advisors advocated not waiting for better intelligence, should it come. It may never have come, and he may have fled, and so our drone campaigns are examples of that. Part of their success depended on using things called signature strikes, where you have good intelligence, but not perfect intelligence about who you're targeting. And, and so there's not just intelligence failure, but policy failure. My friend, former DNI, Jim Clapper, used to joke, there's only two conditions in life, intelligence failure and policy success. And, it's not exactly true. There's plenty of policy failure too.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it seems like what happens is policy failure becomes intelligence failure, becomes policy failure again.
Right.
But
Right.
you sort of collapse on the intelligence failure because
Right.
you said, immaculate perfection, and that's kind of the expectation of intelligence. Something else that you mentioned, and is certainly something that you look at in recent history, is this problem of balancing tactics and strategy. I have to throw in, Ohio State military historian Alan Millett and Williamson Murray said that mistakes in tactics and operations can be corrected, but political and strategic mistakes live forever. What did you see in your career where you saw those mistakes that just are going to live forever? You mentioned a couple with respect to before 9/11, but especially looking forward, where it doesn't seem like we have the room to make those kinds of strategic mistakes anymore with some of the rivalries that we're facing. What advice would you offer for policymakers and professionals today?
Yeah, I don't know that they quite live forever because, it's the world is the land of multiple chances. But, as Clausewitz said, strategy is harder and the errors are more costly. So you can win battles and lose the war. You can strategically overreach, as the Germans did, take on too many enemies, and so that's what I think they're getting, those two great historians were getting at, is that however virtuoso you are at the operational level of war, it's not enough if you screw up the politics. And so, Iraq is sort of an example of that. Topple the regime in 4 weeks, think that we're going to have an easy time afterwards, and you trigger insurgency. Al Qaeda comes in and gets much stronger, and then you get sectarian conflict, and you have a real tough of a time just tamping things down. Now, we eventually do with the surge, but that's a case where getting the politics wrong, about Iraq, what would happen when you uncork this bottle, really matters. It doesn't matter how fast you can, how dominant you are militarily, and you can topple the regime when you get, as Clausewitz would say, not quite the war you expected. That's the first job of the statesman, to know what kind of war you're getting into. And so that's where the big failures come in. And, in my career, again, briefly worked on Lebanon issues after the Beirut bombings in 1983 of our embassy and the Marine barracks. And we had a failure of policy, but also it was not really understanding, I think, at the time what we were getting into in Lebanon, and Hezbollah was being created at the time in the wake of the Israeli invasion, et cetera, that made it, very, very difficult for someone trying to be a peacekeeper in a place where you just couldn't keep peace.
I'm really hearing the O&A experience coming out here with the Clausewitz, and then I think Archidamus, Peloponnesian War. You have to decide what will be our war at the
end. Right.
So I'm here, I'm hearing the education portion. So speaking of which, what will be our war? Looking at the world today, what will be our war? That what's on the horizon that you perceive? How do we need to prepare? Leverage that strategic net assessment experience.
Yeah, so I think the main feature of the world we're going into is a new Cold War with principally China and secondarily Russia and other allies they may have down the road, but with different characteristics from the old Cold War. And some don't like to use the term Cold War because, it was taken for history. But, when you look at its characteristics, it really meant a global competition between two superpowers, undergirded by strategic nuclear weapons that could annihilate their adversary if used, and therefore led to strategic deterrence. But a Cold War went on through proxies, through combinations of direct and indirect conflict, indirect for the first Cold War, and likely to be that way given the escalation risks. But you still then, one, you can have plenty of conflict of various kinds, but two, you have to win whatever this systems competition is. It's not, if you succeed in deterring great power war, you've won half the battle. You still may lose the broader war, the strategic competition, even though there's been no military conflict. And so that's the challenge I think we principally face with China and Russia right now, but principally China, is that the central competition is an economic and technological one. Who's going to have the world's biggest and most powerful economy? Who's going to lead in technology? How do they translate that into all forms of power? How do they translate that into influence? And then you have this information environment that is, I call it polluted, using environmental metaphors, but where information is far more powerful and disinformation is far more powerful than it's been in the past. And Russia's been using that a lot, but so have the Chinese. And so that affects this competition for influence. And that may not be the only two features. I mean, it could take all kinds of other turns. Covert action in the future will likely be similar in some ways, but different, adapting to these new conditions. Gray zone wars could look different than they did in the Cold War, all part of this strategic competition. But that's what I write about in one of the last chapters of the book, about what we have to do to get our domestic house in order, to ensure deterrence, to win the intelligence wars, but also this economic and technological competition and influence wars. And that's what I think it will primarily be about. But, I could certainly be wrong in lots of aspects there.
The information piece is really fascinating. I use the same pollution metaphor. So there's the view that OSINT is going to clear the fog of war, but what I perceive, and especially OSINT, social media propaganda, is it's spreading the smog of war. So, you lift some of the fog, like you can see what's going on tactically, but then there's so much that creates this smog. Really, it's not fog anymore. So with the information environment, what you're also talking about is ideas fundamentally. How should America compete in that regard? Because you mentioned the military dominance, and that's really only one piece of the puzzle. How do we compete for ideas?
Yeah, so that's a challenging aspect too, because in a number of ways, because one, democracies are kind of struggling right now in this new environment. It's hard to govern in certain respects. And you see that across democracies. And then, unfortunately, you always have in these new things, offense, defense competitions, and the smog part, or whatever it is doing pretty well right now. And some technologies are enabling it, deep fakes and others, to maybe make it even more powerful, or automated things, other uses of AI. And one of the challenges we face in the US-China competition that we didn't have in the Cold War is the competitors, in some respects, are less differentiated, in the sense that, rather than being systemically differentiated, communism economically and politically, you have autocratic capitalism versus democratic capitalism in some form, and mixture of state and government. But what it means is that rather than the stark differences that we had politically in the Cold War, where, if you're the Soviets, you're working with communist parties, which means you're trying to undermine a lot of governments around the world, and they don't like to be undermined. And so they're ripe for being allies with the US. The Chinese aren't playing that game. They're not trying to build communist parties around the world. They're creating influence instruments, but they're going to various authoritarian governments and saying, we want to do business with you. We'll even help you with security. We want you to stay in power. The US is just badgering you about human rights and is not a very good investment partner. We're a much better country to do business with. And it's proven to be a reasonably good argument, not a perfect argument. They've had their troubles when they've been too rapacious and others, but they're doing well in Africa and Latin America, as are the Russians even. With this, we'll help you dig for gold. We'll get our little share of it. We'll help you with security. It's all we've got, but it's working with some governments in the Sahel and elsewhere. So that's the challenge for U.S. foreign policy, of how do we adapt to this new environment and come up with effective counters so we don't lose the battle for the global South.
And reflecting on the Cold War, there's two planes here. There's the overt, and then there's the covert, with which you're very familiar. And I always, like, you mentioned the program, and one of the programs was, I believe it was A Dinosaur, was where we reintroduced Solzhenitsyn and Soviet literature, or banned literature in the Soviet Union, back into the Soviet Union. And that was one way that we competed for ideas. Where do you see this, again, divergence between the overt and covert war, especially because in light of what we know now about the Cold War with declassification, what were some of the best practices, and say not best practices, for how to compete covertly?
Yeah, so anytime you're wildly inconsistent with your overt policy, and then it's revealed for one reason or another, whatever that is, where your values and interests seem to really clash, you not only have domestic political problems coming out of that, but you damage your reputation internationally. And so you really have to weigh that. I talk about a Washington Post test, or you could substitute New York Times or whatever. But, even a muscular covert action, lethal covert action or other things, ought to pass that test that, if revealed for whatever reason to the American people, they ought to say, okay, I see why our government was doing that. It made sense strategically. It wasn't wildly inconsistent with our values, or certainly so strongly supported our interests. Didn't seem peripheral. We're doing something that seems kind of bad for no reason, that it makes sense. And, so some of our great cases, support for solidarity in Poland, it's kind of the David and Goliath issue. It always helps to be on the side of David in these things. One of the values you asked about, overt and covert, is that what people don't realize is covert doesn't mean different information or disinformation necessarily, or particularly even what they used to call black propaganda, something that is obviously false. The U.S. sponsored AIDS in Africa as the Soviets charged, and other things. What it means is just the mechanism of distributing it is covert. Who's behind it, and sometimes that's the sole factor that makes that information effective. Doing it through covert channels rather than overt. So the State Department or other agencies that are saying democracy is a good thing, and you ought to be like us, and it doesn't resonate with a lot of audiences for a variety of reasons. They don't want to be completely like us, or they don't want to be told by us, even if they do want that. So sometimes enabling local actors to carry on the debate, but you got to do that covertly, makes all the difference and makes it more effective.
And I think that element of adhering still to the truth, or the truth as we know it. I just remembered the dinosaur program was Dr. Zhivago. So
yes,
this is arguably great literature, and
right.
It's not even American literature; it's your own literature, which I think is a very different thing than trying to force, say, like American literature, American values.
Yes,
It's the strategic empathy that General McMaster talks about, for instance, and
right.
That's powerful, I think, in a way that we always think in terms of hard power. And you yourself, you use the term escalation dominance. And I was hoping to ask you a little bit more about the escalation dominance piece too, because I think there's many ways to perceive it. But what I wanted to understand is how you perceive escalation dominance, across all these elements of grand strategy and national power. And, if you could use an example for where you see us, where we could be capably using escalation dominance today.
Yeah. So when people think of escalation, they think of risk, of something getting out of control or becoming dangerous, working up the famous Schelling or Herman Kahn, ladder to all-out nuclear war. And, and it has its application there. I was trying to apply it as an operational concept to how you get success in operations in certain cases when you can achieve this form of operational dominance. Substitute the word escalation there, where your adversary really can't react well, or you have them pinned down. And so we out escalated the Soviets within a narrow band in Afghanistan in the 1980s that convinced them that they couldn't win and they were losing worse and worse. Famous case of escalation dominance is World War II, where the Japanese run wild the first 6 months of the war, and then we adapt and get better operationally, but we outproduce them. It's the mobilization of American society that's this incredible strategic weapon. And then even in our drone campaigns, once we got the intensity up properly and the policies right and the tactics right and everything, Al-Qaeda couldn't react anymore. It was too much of an onslaught for them. Something less than that, and it's like strategic bombing, in earlier decades, they adapt to it. They don't like it, but they learn to live with it and can still plan and operate. And so it's trying to achieve that effect. Colin Powell called it overwhelming force. It doesn't have to be big necessarily. So Afghanistan 01 is another case where the Afghan opposition had no chance against the Taliban, but they were bottled up in the Northeast. But once you provide CIA and special operations advisors with them and couple that with U.S. precision air power, the advantage shifts dramatically to the U.S. side. And so, we can enable a local actor to really achieve that dominance with somewhat limited means. And, the art of it sounds easy to talk about. The art of it is finding out exactly what ways and means and how much means you really need to achieve those effects.
Clausewitz said everything in war is very simple, but even the simplest thing is very difficult.
Right.
So it seems to hold true in your experience.
Yeah. But so in my case, I really mean it as kind of a way to think about operations to achieve decisiveness.
And, looking across all the different, we tend to get focused on covert action paramilitary, thinking in terms of dominance and military power, or, hard power basically versus soft power. And, we already talked about there's a difference between the two. So I have to ask you, this is a tough bureaucratic question because you've seen both sides and worn both hats. So one of the recent phenomenon that some intelligence officers have commented on is they felt that there was a paramilitarization of the agency during the global war on terror. And the perception, again, of some former officers is now with a strategic transition towards great power rivalry, perhaps the agency needs to get back to, what Dulles called, the craft of intelligence, a different type of intelligence, Cold War era intelligence. So here's the tough question for you. If you had to choose who would do paramilitary operations, and this was a debate early in CIA history, the agency or say DOD, who would you choose?
Yeah, so for me, it's an easy choice. I think we've largely got it right, which is you need both, and they serve different purposes, and they can interact. And so let me explain. So basically, CIA is our primary peacetime force for a variety of reasons. Those reasons are it does help control escalation, prevent a wider war, having things covert, even if it's a thin veil of covertness. Your foreign partners may prefer it that way. They may only agree to a program if it's done in intelligence channels by CIA. So it's not the nature of the operation. It's not the capabilities. It's not that one is better than the other. Now, CIA has more of a in-place global network than SOF does, and so you don't want to have to reproduce that. It's better to kind of layer on capabilities on what you have. There are faults. CIA has been criticized from time to time for not professionalizing covert action enough. For making it a bit of a pickup game that people who do collection all their life or work with liaison service suddenly are in charge of covert action, and nothing has prepared them for that. It'd be like a submariner running an army. They're really good at submarine warfare, but they don't know much about the army. If the CIA lacks capabilities, special operations operatives or cyber or drones or anything else, we have mechanisms where we can detail them over, and the reverse would also be true for different things, but it could work the other way as well. And then, as Afghanistan 01 shows, once you go to war and you're going to do unconventional war, then special operations forces tend to be in the lead. CIA may still play a role, but its role is not singular anymore. It's not the dominant actor. It's just another actor usually in those things. And so, after the Bay of Pigs, there was talk about shifting paramilitary operations to DOD, getting CIA out of that business. Time to time in Vietnam, some programs, there was a thing called Operation Switchback, where CIA started with tribal people in Vietnam and handed some of that over to the military. As long as it's not getting them out of business, I think that even only one of the recommendations, the 9/11 Commission, that wasn't adopted was to transfer paramilitary operations to DOD, which President Bush and Secretary Rumsfeld at the time recognized, wasn't a great idea. So I think you need both capabilities. And I don't know if I answered all your questions.
You did. It's the war college answer. It depends.
It depends, but it's useful to have both. And there are things that go with it about, as I said, about professionalization. But that's true also of special operations in the military.
And to think through, actually go back to the history, because just because we have a certain system today doesn't mean it was done by necessarily great design at the time. So you
Yeah.
have to actually think through how we got there.
Yeah, and let me say something else too about the militarization of the GWAT. What were we going to do when we had Al Qaeda killing more Americans than the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor, if not use some form of hard power? And if CIA was the right instrument to do that, go after them. I mean, presidents are going to do that. Presidents repeatedly turn to covert action in peacetime for variety of reasons, and as I mentioned, and to ignore that reality is silly. And if the agency just focused on intelligence, on collection and analysis, it would be a weaker, less useful agency. Not just weaker bureaucratically, but less useful to presidents. And and so then because they've repeatedly called for it to do all kinds of different things. And the agency has global responsibilities. It has to do China and terrorism at the same time. Now, the balance may shift. The people who do it may be different in certain cases. That's fine. You manage that as an organization, just like you do the Department of Defense. It'd be like saying, well, I need a Navy, but not an Army. And, and it's the same with analysis, or strategic rather than tactical. Analysis is the center, in a way, of the day-to-day business of the IC. But it's not the only. If you didn't have unique collection, I hate to say this with two PhDs here, but you'd be like academics. You'd have no advantage, right? If you didn't have that unique collection. And same thing, from time to time, you have to influence events. Bill Casey famously said, you're not going to change the world with analysis, so.
Bill Casey's consummate Cold Warrior. I got a chance to read a lot of his records in the Reagan archives. Consummate Cold Warrior.
Yeah.
Looking at scale, because this is an interesting conversation too, as far as it pertains to soft intelligence. One of the perceptions that you have is that Intel was really supporting special operations during the global war on terror. And arguably, you could say that relationship might change a little bit now, where soft supports intelligence for great power competition, great power rivalry. Where do you see the relationship evolving from? Because again, you've been in both fields, and you've been at the nexus of both as a policymaker as well.
Yeah, so I don't think it's really accurate to say Intel was supporting special ops, because Intel was also supporting Intel a lot, supporting covert action. But special ops became far more central to the global war on terror, not surprisingly. It's the nature of their business. And, and as I said, certain parts of CIA as well. Counterterrorism Center was, our lead agency for doing a lot of these things globally in CIA. As you shift to great power competition that is more multifaceted strategically, at the grand strategic level, obviously, economics matter more. Lots of things matter more than when you compare the war on terror with Cold War with a superpower. But, if there is a war, SOF is more likely to be an adjunct to conventional forces, to, others. As I did in the Cold War, we were prepared to go into Eastern Europe, work with resistance movements, do special reconnaissance. I was even trained with backpack nuclear weapons to try to slow the Soviet advance. But, the big fight is really this slugfest of armies and air forces and navies trying to resupply them. And, we're trying to help. We're not the main effort anymore. We're a supporting effort. The caveat to that is the Cold War part of it, is that where it becomes more proxy war, because deterrence at some level is preventing direct conflict that might escalate out of control, that competition for influence, then things like special operations or covert action take on more importance. So this competition for influence in the global South, a lot of your big conventional might isn't going to win that battle for you. Short of major war, it's what instruments do you have to influence, and there soft can play a larger role necessarily. But I think the general point is right, is that the bigger the competition, or the more high intensity the competition, and the more multifaceted it is, then all elements, including soft, play their part, but that's just a part.
I tend to have a fairly expansive approach to education and education, professional military education. Education is soft, and one of the things that the conversation I've had with friends in soft, for instance, is we can't shoot our way out of all the problems we have as a country right now. And in fact, some of the greatest challenges we have are domestically. And so, I know from your career, most of the time you were looking outward as a military intelligence and policymaker professional, but using that as a frame of reference to inform what you see as problems here, what are the domestic trends that you're worried about, and how are they affecting American national security and statecraft?
Yeah, so that's an area that, is not my expertise, but it's something, if you ask what keeps me awake at night the most, it's that. It's the domestic bases of our power and how they're eroding, the polarization, the diminishing national unity. What goes with that is often ambition or resilience. I mentioned earlier about economic and technological competition. Those spring from non-national security sources and domestic sources. And, so all that really determines how well America will do in this new strategic competition. And it's a thing we most have to get right. At some level, it's a political problem, and addressing that, you hope it doesn't take some major crisis for the right politician or political leader to rise to the occasion and rally the country before it's too late. But that is, in my chapter on winning the new Cold War, that's front and center, number one, as problem number one for us. And then you get to the rest of it. And tying it back to your question about you make strategic mistakes, they're more costly. Also, I would add in this case, it's strategic capabilities, but it isn't just that you can't shoot yourself out of all wars, is that you got to get the politics and strategy right. And where have struggled a bit as a country, including in the global war on terror, is at the strategic level. It's not so much tactically. We did very well tactically. It's, were you trying to do too much in nation building, or what, how are you going to win this global war on terror to reduce the terrorism threat, but keep it reduced? And, some of it is military or covert action or intelligence, but there are other parts of that. And they're all in that realm of strategy and politics. Again, it's not just like soft power versus hard power. It's really getting that part right. Do you have a theory of victory that works, and can you sustain it for a reasonable period of time? So I think that's exactly right.
And as you explained in your introduction, and by way of conclusion to this amazing interview, and speaking of we've produced such proficient intelligence and special operations professionals in this country, and I have to ask you, what advantages do they have today that you didn't have? But what advantages did you have when you were operational that you don't think they had necessarily? And what advice would you offer to our contemporary SOF and intelligence professionals today?
Well, and the policymakers and political leaders, they have more advantages just because things have evolved, but it's all relative. If the threat environment is much worse or, hostile to them, then it becomes a challenge. So one of the challenges we have in intelligence now is what we call ubiquitous technical surveillance. It's just a function of cameras and AI and being able to track everything. It makes it harder to do clandestine operations. Now we'll work that problem and develop appropriate tradecraft, et cetera. Advanced air defenses have made infiltration and exfiltration tougher, as always, reasonably tough as those defenses started appearing. But, it's gotten worse in certain respects. There are a lot of capabilities we have today and experience, extensive warfighting experience we didn't have in the Cold War, that make better operators, et cetera. We had capabilities for the bin Laden raid. I can't really talk about them, but that we didn't have 10 years before. And we had 10 years of experience when we did it. And so that increased the odds of success. Some of the advantages that I think I had a long time ago, and this is not unique to that period, but it was an appetite more for strategic decentralization. If you got the strategy or policy right, letting the operators do their thing. So, for instance, we would often send two operators to do something in CIA, and often one operator, where today you might use 8 or more. It's like CIA has moved a little more in the soft direction, which is not necessarily good in terms of getting a force multiplier out of it. They each have their unique roles, and some of that related to that comes with policy micromanagement, because you can strategically try to control things. It certainly doesn't mean you should. It almost always has negative consequences. But it's tempting for the White House to want to do that, to really specify, you're going to ask Mother May I for everything you do, or you're not going to do it. And therefore, you strategically underreach, you don't achieve your objectives. And so that's one of the dangers of all these communication technologies, and to be able to see things, all around the world, et cetera, is that you don't decentralize sufficiently. Where we did in the global war on terror, or with Al Qaeda, as I describe it, and its allies and offshoots, we did much better. When we really tightened up, we didn't do as well. So I think there's those lessons as well. But the big challenge for our intelligence professionals and special operators is to adapt to this new environment, is figure out how you're going to do clandestine operations in this environment, how you're going to adapt analysis to new targets, for instance, this economic, and you need different kinds of analysts to tell how you're doing in quantum computing versus your adversary than how, what their political leader is thinking, or how, their traditional military forces are being built up, and then how you're going to do covert action to affect the strategic balance.
Well, and that's something I think you've done very well, sir. Well, in your career, what can we say? Writer, soldier, strategist, spy. You've worn it all, and so that adaptability really does emerge from your book. I can't thank you enough for your time and really the wisdom that you've offered, not just for your career, but then contributing to that with this volume that I encourage our students certainly to read, and for those who are viewing the interview to also read as well. So thank you once again, Dr. Vickers.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's been a great conversation.